What is up, everyone? Welcome back to another beautiful day outside the sun, so you guys can see. Or just hanging out here in the neighborhood. So today I want to talk to you guys about why free will doesn't actually exist, and this will be kind of like another point and continuation off of what I was talking about before with like how the Christian God can't exist. So basically, free will is limited to you and your own, how would you say this? Your own human body, right? So we have different chemicals inside of us, like our biochemistry determines our mood, and so we are limited to this physical body. So if you want to say free will exists, well, there's going to be a limitation just because we are human on that free will. So then if you want to define free will as, well, of course it's based off of human free will, right? Then you would say, well, of course you were talking about free will amongst humans, right? We're not talking about free will in general or with all different beings and whatever kind of thing that you can imagine. Well, then from that point, you would then still have to argue and break down the point of free will in the context of being within the different societies that we have in the or around the world as well. Also, so then you would have the breakdown of free will within each society that we live in, which is going to be another problem for this argument, right? Because if, say, for example, I am someone who grows up in America, I'm going to have a lot of different opportunities that someone who grows up in a extreme poverty situation, say in an African country or a place like India, because they are going to be limited by the system in which they grow up in. So, yeah, even if you wanted to make the argument that we're talking about specifically free will, and of course we're using the parameters of being limited by a physical body and things like this, like a human body, you're still going to have to talk about the free will within a certain system, which is going to be your country's governmental system and things like this. You're also going to have to talk about the differences between being a human man or woman, like being limited on your biological differences based on gender, but then also you're going to have the differences on what food you were given when you were growing up and how developed you become as a child into adulthood based on pretty much getting lucky and whether or not you were going to be properly nourished. And then also depending on your biochemistry, which is typically determined a lot by the food that you're consuming as a child and the food that you're currently consuming will depend. So that'll all depend on like your biochemistry with your like testosterone, estrogen, your dopamine amounts. I don't know, there's probably some other things that I'm forgetting. There's dopamine and that's like the feel good chemical, right? But then I think there's other chemicals as well too. So yeah, then I would say also your free will is going to depend heavily on the society that you grow up in, not just because of the government, but also dependent on the culture that you grow up in. So we're going to be talking about, let's say, for example, we can use the example again with the United States versus India. The culture there is a lot different in India versus here in America, or if you want to talk about Japan or whatever. So you're going to be limited, like say, for example, there's going to be certain things that you just don't do in Japan. Like if you're a Japanese person, for example, I love Japan. I went there last year, about 3 months time out of the like 7-8 months that I traveled. And what I love about there so much is the public transportation is very clean. But what happens in Japanese society is they don't talk on public transportation. They're usually very quiet. I mean, you can chat with your friends, but typically you don't go on the phone. And overall, their ideology is to not be, is to not disturb others, basically, right? So in that situation, do you have free will if the society is constantly pressuring you to not do a certain thing? And I'm not saying it's wrong, but like a Japanese person is typically just never going to be allowed on public transportation. So that's just one example. I don't know, I'm trying to think of something that we just don't do here in America, or that a lot of people would frown upon, maybe talking bad about Christianity. So even though I'm kind of doing that, but yeah, I mean, America is pretty free though. You can like usually say typically anything you want to, but there are a lot of people, at least lately, who have been getting a good amount of backlash for certain things, right? I'm trying to think. So we talked about the culture, and then yeah, so we could talk about the religion as well too. So like if you have a particular religion that your society is really big into. For example, I use this when I talked about in my previous video or other video about why the Christian God can't exist, is that if you grow up in a society, geographically your free will is also limited in that way. Because if you grow up in a society that is very strong with Islam, and I'm trying to think of how to put this, what is it called? Sharia law. There's certain things that you can't do, like you can't really listen to music, right? Or like certain types of music. You can't drink. There's like no alcohol allowed in the society as well, because the religion has hindered that so much. So like I said, does that mean that you have free will if your society and everyone around you is thinking a certain way? And to oppose that would be extremely uncomfortable, because most people try to avoid stress as much as possible, right? So that would be like a good example of something that would be contrary to the idea that we have free will, because there's so many, like I said, there's so many different factors that limit you on your choices. So like even in a society, like there's always going to be, I actually had a conversation with someone about this as far as like work goes. There's always going to be a certain amount of people that have to be at the lower levels of the company. So for example, like there's not always going to be there's not going to be like 20 bosses or 100 bosses, right? Because there has to be people who are under them in order to make the company function correctly, right? So that's just how it is. And I think the saying goes like, too many chiefs, not enough Indians, right? But in this example, for like from a societal perspective, you're not going to have that as an option, because there's just not going to be enough positions open in order to have, you know, 200 people be the boss of a company, and like a company of 200 people, right? Like not everyone can be the CEO. It's just not possible. So the same thing with life in general is there's always going to be those who are at the top and then those who are at the bottom, in quotations, because I don't necessarily think that that's like really a thing entirely, even though if you look at the natural order and like the animal kingdom, for example, right, there's always going to be the prey and the predator, right? There's always going to be the ones who hunt and the ones who are hunted. So like in nature, there is technically, yeah, hierarchy. You have like the plants and then the bugs, and then you have like the lizards and stuff, and then you have like the cats, and then you have well, I guess cats are technically kind of at the top, and like eagles and stuff like that, right? Eagles, cats, killer whales, I guess you should say orcas. So yeah, because of that, you're also always going to be in like a certain part of the certain level of the system, right? So for example, some people are just not intellectually capable enough to do certain jobs, right? Like they just grew up unfortunately without proper nutrition, or they didn't develop properly, or their genes weren't exactly the best as well too. But typically it comes down to nutrition. It's like your genes, you can pretty much everyone's genes are good. It's just you typically, what we see nowadays is don't have proper nutrition. So because of that, there's always going to be some who are stronger and bigger, right? Like, so for example, based on the male like human population, if you're a taller, you know, more fully built man, you're going to be stronger in general than someone who's shorter, right? Because you have stronger bone density. Your body fully grew with like the muscles and everything like that. They fully developed, whereas someone who is typically shorter does not have that full development, right? The biggest example and best way to know whether or not someone was fully developed is if their jaw fully developed and they were actually able to keep their wisdom teeth. And that's something that I talked in a previous video. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to shine a little bit of light on this for you guys about why free will actually doesn't exist. And this is kind of piggybacking off of why you can know that the Christian God also doesn't exist. This is just one example. I've already broke down many of them. So anyways, I will see you guys in the next one. Thank you for watching. Peace.